Welcome. You've reached Christian-apologist.com, and I'm really excited today to be here with Andrew and with Joshua, and we're going to have a mock debate on some of the really tough questions that atheists have asked us. But before we do that, let me go ahead and have Andrew and Joshua introduce themselves. You want to start, Andrew?
Sure. Hey, everyone. I'm Andrew Stratelates. I'm really active on Twitter and occasionally blog at redpillreligion.com, which is sort of a loosely organized project talking about theism in the modern world, how it impacts culture and politics, and sort of examining things from the theistic perspective.
Excellent. Thank you. And Joshua?
Well, I like to get on Twitter. I teach history, United States history and world history. I just like to get on Twitter and read a lot. And you can also find me on Patreon under Joshua J. Brister. Feel free to do that. That would really help me in my endeavors. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. So, well, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's listening here in the audience, and thank you for joining us today. And so my first question, I'm going to play the role of an atheist. And so I collected a bunch of questions that I have been asked, and I'm going to go ahead and ask Joshua and Andrew to answer these questions. And the first question is, do you believe, I believe as an atheist, I think that evolution disproves God of the Bible. Prove me wrong.
Okay, I guess I'll go first, right? So I think this fundamentally is a misunderstanding of how much evolution actually articulates, right? So generally the argument goes something like this, that the God of the Bible pivots or balances on whether or not Adam and Eve the Genesis creation was journalistic in its articulation, right? That things as described in Genesis occurred totally, and that is the full and sufficient physical understanding of things, and evolution is in conflict with that. And that's true, right? That the way that evolution is described is not exactly journalistically the same as what is articulated in Genesis. So there are two ways to sort of get around this, right? One is to say that evolution articulates something like the process after what happened in the garden, or a parallel process, right? That it explains something about the physical and biological nature of things, but not necessarily the spiritual or ontological, right? And if we permit this, which is basically how things like the Roman Catholic Church do it, Eastern Orthodoxy and Anglicanism and so on and so forth, that basically evolution is a description of how God created, but not why or for what reason, right? And we can even go into detail like this, that evolution actually doesn't even contradict Adam and Eve being the first ontological humans that were created miraculously through God's direct action. There's actually some evidence based on genetics that there was a very strong bottleneck in the human population, which would be very consistent with some readings of Genesis. And so basically what evolution defeats, if you believe evolution is true, is sort of this unsophisticated journalistic reading of Genesis.
Joshua, that seems reasonable to me. Okay. I shouldn't give in. I'm supposed to be the atheist, so I'm going to come back at you in a minute.
Well, I think I would say I think evolution isn't actually an argument for God. I think it shows the design through the historical process. It shows coincidence upon coincidence upon coincidence. Robert, I'm forgetting the name. I have the book. Barra and Tipler. They have a book called The Anthropic Principle, and it lists 10 steps, each of which is so improbable to happen that it cries out for an explanation. Each of these constants and quantities of the universe, that even to have evolution as a possibility to happen. So I think that the fact that evolution was even a possibility is an argument for design, for God creating the universe by on a platform on a design motif. I would also say this: man, writes Lorne Isley, is the cosmic orphan. He is the only creature in the universe that asks why. Other animals have instincts to guide them, but man has learned to ask questions. Who am I? Man asks. Why am I here? Where am I going? Very profound questions. Animals don't ask this. This differentiates us from animals. Aristotle, in his Metaphysics, said all men by nature desire to know. An indication of this is the design we take in our senses. For even apart from their usefulness, they are loved for themselves, and above all others, the senses of sight. And one more by Aristotle: if the art of shipbuilding were in the wood, we would have ships by nature. Very profound statements by Aristotle. You can see design in the evolutionary process. The very fact that it builds toward something that we can use as tools, or something that can get us to the moon and back by starting from no less humble beginnings as cavemen, shows that evolution is guiding us. But what's guiding evolution? That's why I think evolution is a strong argument for the existence of God.
Yeah, that's right. Basically, and it's most obvious in biology that biology relies on an implicit teleology that they don't acknowledge for these things to occur, right? And the fundamentals of evolution, even Aristotle articulated, right? That things that you get more of, you will tend to get more of in the future. So and that sort of thing is that. Selection specifically, and what nature is with a capital N, evolution is silent on, right? It just says nature selects. But what is nature, right? If you read it with a capital N, as the Stoics do, nature is God's providence of the world, right? And there's nothing contrary to biblical Christianity in stating that God's providence guides life and biological systems.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a really hard question, and this is the one that I think actually of all of the atheist arguments is probably the strongest one, and it's: if there is an omnibenevolent God, why is there evil in the world? And let me actually phrase a question that Anastasia Polikakos said. She said, there are instances of unnecessary suffering that nobody hears about. So there is no greater good that couldn't be obtained by that suffering. And she uses the example of a person who's sexually assaulted and abused and tortured and abducted and killed, and no one hears about exactly what happens in that particular instance. So she says, in that case, then there must not be a greater good. So how would you respond to that?
Well, let me try to go out this. When I said in the debate that there could be a chain reaction through the historical process, why does it require us to see the links in the chain? We don't know if there are other links. Maybe because of her, she starts the link in the chain, or maybe because of unknown processes, the link in the chain gets corrected. We don't know how God can correct or allows one particular person to suffer throughout history. That is not a good argument. So I think the probabilistic argument from evil, we are not in a position to weigh these probabilities without any sort of justification, especially if you consider our background knowledge. Remember, I showed on this, and I did the probability calculus, our background knowledge, which is just showing one instance, What if our background knowledge has the arguments from natural theology in them? So now we have to consider, does the probabilistic argument of evil disprove the existence of God, considering that we have the cosmological and teleological and the arguments from the resurrection and so forth? This is what Alvin Plantinga describes as dwindling probabilities in his book, Warranted Christian Belief. So it's very hard to make these probabilistic judgments. We are simply not in a position to know.
Okay, Andrew, what do you say? I'm still not convinced. Andrew?
Sure. I'll take the hard-ass position. The hard-ass position is there are no true evils except moral evil, right? And the fact that you suffer and are raped is not an evil to you. It's suffering, yes, but the fact that these horrible things happen to me or you isn't in itself an evil, right? The evil is the intention of the actor who engaged in evil against you. And when you look at it this way, and like I said, this is sort of the hard-ass position, right? That the suffering in the world isn't a moral evil, right? And moral evils are what are logically the things that are logically difficult in the problem of evil. And so if we look at it this way, we're asking, well, why do we permit this horrible person of kidnapping you and torturing you and doing all these horrible things? Why does God permit it? And the answer is that God has given within you the moral choice of whether or not you will commit evil, and in the same choice exists in this person who is committing evil, but they're misusing it and choosing to go away from goodness to evil, right? And you know that this is sort of the Stoic position, and like I said, it's really rough and it's not very sympathetic. But that would be my retort to that, is that it's not. It is not an evil to suffer, and these natural evils, if they're outside of your control, aren't moral evils or the greatest evil that can occur. And what's obvious to me is that all of these things are just opportunities for us as individuals to take the right action. So even if no one hears about it, it's an opportunity for both the victim to show moral fortitude, and it's also an opportunity for the criminal to repent and stay their hand, and whether or not they do that is up to them.
So that brings us to a question that I've been asked on based on this same exact issue. Now, what if this criminal is someone like a Jeffrey Dahmer, who at the very end of his life, right before he's about to be executed, or actually I think he was killed in prison, but right before that, he decides that he's a Christian. Does he get to go to heaven?
Sorry for jumping in. It depends on whether you think purgatory is part of heaven, right? So if someone like Jeffrey Dahmer is like, oh shit, I totally did this horrible thing in my life, and he throws himself on the ground before Christ and says, you know, please forgive me, and I'll do anything to be forgiven, then at that point he's going to have a lot of work to do, right? He's going to have to change the spirit, his spirit, right? And God will help him, of course. But you know, we can talk about what purgatory is and things like that. But I think that C.S. Lewis is correct that in some sense purgatory is the mudroom of heaven, and that if you come to heaven and you're all messy from your sins, there's going to be a cleaning process, and you're going to get scrubbed to be made clean, and some of this is going to be actions that you're going to take, probably prayer, to try to make those things right that you did wrong.
But how is that little boy going to feel if he sees Jeffrey Dahmer in heaven, the little boy he abducted and killed?
Oh, well, if the boy is in heaven, he will see any goodness. He will see the goodness in Jeffrey Dahmer fully actualized and fully done, right? Because I'm sure that Jeffrey Dahmer looked maybe innocent or good to some moment to that little boy, and that little moment will be what is fulfilled in all of the being of Jeffrey Dahmer, assuming that he's gone through the purgatorial process.
Josh, did you want to add to that?
Well, the first question, can you restate it again?
Well, I basically I'm looking at why should a repentant murderer be allowed to go into heaven? Why should we allow, or why would God allow a repentant murderer to go ahead into heaven when he doesn't allow some atheists to go into heaven and their only crime is denying his presence? So they're going to burn for hell, burn to death forever and ever and ever. And their only crime is that they just lacked a belief in God. So
well,
why would
I've been thinking about this, and I remember when Jesus. I've been thinking about this, and when I was thinking about it, when Jesus said you need to have faith as just as small as a mustard seed, I think that the atheists, even though they say that they don't believe in God, I think their actions speak louder than words. How they carry their life, what they do to others. If they had faith in the past, I think many people can be saved by that way. I'm not a universalist. I think a person can reject God, but not just by mere propositional knowledge, verbal knowledge. It has to do with a person's life, how they lead it. And who are we to say that Jeffrey Dahmer couldn't have repented of his sins? That is the serious lack of humility to say that he could not get into heaven by sincerely asking for forgiveness and following God. So again, William James, Thomas Reed, two people I brought up in me and Andrew's debate today. They were for common sense. We are not in a position. We're finite human beings, not infinite. We can't determine try to figure out what is on someone's heart. So I think he could be saved. It's possible.
What about Adolf Hitler? He murdered 6 million Jews. Can he all of a sudden show up in heaven? I don't think I want to share heaven with someone like Adolf Hitler.
Well, if he does, you won't be sharing it with he as he was on Earth, right? So that's sort of the thing, is that our sanctified nature of who we ought to be is very distinct from who we are on Earth, unless you're a saint.
Yeah, and that's how amazing glorification is. We'll be given new bodies. Jesus was resurrected in bodily form, but as it tells in John, that when they were out at sea fishing, they had difficulties recognizing him at first, and then when they saw him, that they something was different. It was a glorified body. Our bodies right now are caricatures of what they could be, what they're aimed at, what everything that we know in our nature aims at. And again, I go back. Who are we to say, oh man, that a person cannot repent or couldn't understand the follies of their ways? Now, I don't bet on it, but it's certainly possible.
So why does God give infinite punishment for finite crimes?
Well, this is easy. God doesn't give infinite punishment for finite crimes. God gives infinite consequences for infinite choices.
That's nice.
Josh.
Very nice. Yeah, I would say it's our choice where we end up. This is, as y'all know, this is what C.S. Lewis said. We we have a responsibility. This isn't just a mere game. And when you think of it like that, you know that the ramifications are so important. How we treat others. When I teach my kids about character, you know, you can't get away from world history or U.S. history without showing the character of these people. Alexis de Tocqueville, what he saw in America, God, people worshiping God freely. That's what builds character, true character, lasting character. And to go against that, you know, to just smugly dismiss God, you know, I think is deserving. You know, we all wind up where we decide ultimately.
Well, I'm glad you brought up U.S. history, because that reminds me of another argument that I want to make, and that's slavery. Why did Jesus not outlaw slavery? And we saw it in the Bible. If we go back to Deuteronomy, we can see all of these examples of slavery. So I think that if it were a perfect God, he would have outlawed slavery. No one should own another human.
You
Yeah.
know, I was thinking about this. Go ahead. Go. You first.
Sure. So the 2 points are, one, if we look at what biblical and classical slavery is, right, and compare it to like American chattel slavery. American chattel slavery was far more evil and egregious than anything the Greeks or Romans did or the Jews did, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind, is when we're looking at what biblical slavery was, it was something that was typical and more akin to something like typical at the time and more akin to debt slavery, right? And you know, if we look at debt slavery and employment and the ways that we engage in servitude, we still have servitude in the modern world. The fundamentally, most people are in servitude in the West and everywhere, right? That oftentimes we have a mortgage or student debt. We have an employer that salaries us, which is actually the way that many slaves in antiquity were engaged in. So that's one thing. The other thing is, if we're going to complain about what God permits, why not complain that God allows death into the world? I mean, I think that's a much more egregious and obvious evil than slavery. And if we discuss that, we realize that God only allows physical death in the world to give us spiritual life, right? That in the actual biblical curse, when we are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, it says, humans are going to be really screwed if they're immortal and sinful. So we're not going to let them be immortal, and that's how we're going to save them. And by we, I mean the Trinity, right? And then Christ conquers death. And if we compare like economic arrangements to spiritual salvation and sanctification and glorification, where we become fully who we are in the image of God and free in that sense, it seems pretty obvious that slavery is sort of like a secondary issue, right? And if we actually look at the biblical laws of slavery, they limited it compared to things that he would see in other points of the Near East, right? Like in ancient Sparta, they actually had a rite of passage for their young men, which involved sneaking up on a slave and killing them. And if you notice in the Jewish law, you're not allowed to kill a slave. You can engage in harsh punishment, but you're also allowed to engage in harsh punishment against your children. And that's sort of the thing, is that we And as a Christian, I'm permitted to say this, that the law and things were to create a sort of culture and mode of being that would bring forth both Christ and the church and Christianity, which is now our mode of social being now, or fundamentally should be.
This is kind of like feudalism. Feudalism, for all its bad things, it was a system. It had bad things, of course, but it was a system that worked. We can improve on that, and we did improve on that. Theology gave us the tools to improve on that. The faith in reason, the faith in progress. There's a reason why slavery was banned 2 times in world history, and it was only banned by the West, and Christianity played the most significant role in that. As a world history and U.S. history teacher, I can say that with emphatically. So just as we learn things through the historical process, that's how we learn and mature. The knowledge that the people of the Old Testament had was a limited knowledge, and God was accommodating himself to the language and the cultural concepts and the milieu that they found themselves in. They did the best that they could, but they grew from that. And we are a product of that today. It's theology that got us out of that.
Okay, so that I'm glad you brought up cultures, because that reminds me of this morning I listened to Pine Creek Doug and Inspiring Philosophy, and I listened to some of Pine Creek's tough questions, and one of them was, well, what if you were born in Pakistan? What are the chances are that you'd be a Christian? Are there greater chances you would have been a Muslim if you're born in Pakistan? So therefore, where you're born makes a difference.
Well, but that's a general defeater of all ideological perspectives, right? What's the likelihood that Pine Creek would be an atheist if he was born in Pakistan, where atheism is a capital crime? I mean, and so you can't. Or let's say that he's a libertarian. I don't know what his politics are. What's the likelihood that he'd be a libertarian if he was born in New York City or born in London, England, or all these other things? Just because there is a correlation between geographic locations and certain religions or things like that doesn't imply, it isn't a defeater for beliefs. It doesn't mean that they're arbitrary, right? And if they are, that means that all beliefs are arbitrary. So it's a universal defeater.
Well, that reminds me, there are 3,000 other gods. I'm an atheist. You're an atheist just like me. We're just an atheist over one God that you believe in one God. I believe that all 3,000 are not true. Therefore, you must be truly an atheist just like me with respect to every other God.
Oh my gosh. I think I've heard this argument at least 3,000 times. Go ahead, Josh.
I was listening to how others answered this, and how William Lane Craig in particular answered it in some of my preparation for the debate. I already knew. I mean, I've already seen and studied a lot of this. Of course, we can always study more. Got to always be humble. But we all believe in gods today. The atheist believes in gods. The god of Mars, the god of power, the god of mammon. All is about money. Said Marx, in the god of Aphrodite, the god of sexual pleasure. And that was what Freud said, and others. So we can't get away from the gods. In the 1960s, Alitzer proclaimed the death of God, that death of theology, death of God theology, was going around at that time, which really skewed some of the quest for the historical Jesus, that existentialism that creeps up, that has crept up for a long time, that tries to divide the or tries to say Jesus' resurrection was a spiritual resurrection. Well, you get that from Bultmann and the existentialists. The thing is, we all have our gods, and we carry them along with us every day. It's humility that recognizes that what God will we follow, and if we're going to have humility and take history and science seriously, then we need to bow down and choose what God is here, what is correct, what explains the most data, and I think that's Christianity.
Well, that brings to what makes Jesus why Christianity? Is it just because of, and we already talked about it as it being a function of being born in the West, but why Christianity? Why do we know that, why Jesus instead of all of the other gods that they have in the Hindu beliefs, for example?
Because we have weaponized autism. Sorry, and the reason I'm saying that is, if you look at Christianity, the things that Christianity has above all the other religious systems is, one is the most complete natural theology. We're the best at that in the entire world. And two, the spiritual significance of Christ matches up the paradoxes and inconsistencies of human spiritual life like nothing else does, right? So to basically elaborate this, Christianity literally believes that logic created the world. That's one way to read the word logos, is logic, action, reason created the world. That means that if you're a rationalist in any sense, that you believe that we are able to know the world, then Christianity affirms that. The other thing is that the meta narrative of Christianity is one that I'll put it really bluntly. What is deserving of worship, right? And I'll be really strict. I'll say the only God deserving of worship is the one who would die for me. And there's only one of those gods or concepts of God in the entire world, and that's the Christian concept. God in Christianity is not merely the king or creator of the world. He is also a hero that is willing to save you. And thus, if Christianity has any ground, it also has the most significant spiritual artifact of the religions, right? So the gods of paganism did not die for me. Even the god of Judaism, modern Judaism, did not die for me.
Yeah, I think we need to take history seriously. When we come to, if there's meaning or value, ultimate meaning or value in life, atheism fails. Oh, and a lot of these worldviews, which Andrew picked up, they fail. Let me read by a prominent atheist scholar, philosopher Kai Nielsen, excuse me. We have not been able to show that reason requires the moral point of view, or that all reality, or that all really rational persons unhoodwinked by myth of ideology need not be individual egoists or classical amoralists. Reason doesn't decide here. The picture I've painted for you is not a pleasant one. Reflection on it depresses me. Pure practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. I add this with people like Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn, and many of the French existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, and a plethora of others. Freud. I have lists of quotes where they cannot live happily and consistently with their own philosophy. When you look at what God is here in history, you see one thing that rises above it all, and that's this Christian particularism, this belief that Jesus reigns supreme. This is what ushered in things like science. This belief in theology ushered in like science, education, the Benedict. I'm not going to go into that. Education and so forth. So I think there are solid reasons why to believe Jesus.
Yeah, but what if the atheist would probably respond that, what about walking on water? People don't just walk on water and they don't come back to life from the dead. So,
well, see, that's an idea of miracles. That's talking about miracles. And now if we're going to take history seriously, rather than what one of my debate opponents read, and something I should have brought up, he said, because we can model science, therefore we know it's true. Well, no amount of history can we model or repeat. So history by its very nature is different. And we can study all we want to know about Napoleon Bonaparte, except the person of Napoleon Bonaparte. What made him him? What made him who he was? So if we take history seriously, we're gonna start studying. And that's what I did when I wrote out this probability calculus for the resurrection. And I don't think it proves the resurrection, but it shows that the skepticism that we're all too familiar with from David Hume and Spinoza is not warranted. They didn't even understand probability calculus back then. So I think a sophisticated Christian can believe in the possibility of miracles today. It's the historian with an open mind and an open heart, that William James type of person, that Thomas Reid, that common sense Scottish philosophy type perspective, that can try to find what is behind history, what drives it.
Oops, I forgot my microphone was muted. I was talking. Andrew, did you want to comment on that?
Could you repeat the question real quick?
So I'm saying that people don't just rise from the dead, therefore Christianity must not be true.
Well, if you want to take a faith-based position, you're permitted to. And that's literally what my argument would be, right? That if you're going to axiomatically affirm that miracles are impossible, then you are no longer in any sense epistemically more rigorous than I am. I just have different axioms. And so that's the end of the discussion, that you by faith are an atheist, and therefore I can be through symmetry by faith a Christian, and there's nothing more to discuss.
Okay, well, what about, I've got another really tough question that atheists like to ask, and it has to do with Jephthah in the Bible, in the story in Judges 11. So this man basically promised to God, he made a vow to God that if he were to win a war, he went into battle, that he would sacrifice the first thing to come out of his house when he arrived back home. And so he went back home, and what he saw was his daughter, who came dancing out of the front door, and so he felt really badly, and he wanted to keep his vow to God. Now, how do you answer that?
Isn't that kind of similar to the question we had earlier?
I think we talked about this one off air. So,
Andrew, give your answer again then.
Sure. So there are 2 points here, right? One is that one of the commandments is actually not to make these sorts of promises to God, right? So that you're not held to these things, that you shouldn't do them. And there are a multitude of theological reasons for that we won't get into. But the other thing that if you read all of this, the thing that she does is she goes with her female friends and mourns her virginity, not her life, her virginity. and the most commentaries that I've seen from both Jewish and Christian sources seem to imply that the sacrifice being made is that she's going to be sanctified basically as a nun, or to live a life of celibacy in service to the temple. If we understand these two things, right, it's sort of a realization that this is sort of an illustration of why you shouldn't take those sort of oaths to God, and why he prohibited them, and also that the types of sacrifice God takes are sacrifice of the living, right? And this comes into Christian theology of the Eucharist. The Eucharistic prayer that Episcopalians and Anglicans use is fundamentally make us living sacrifices onto the God, and that instead of like the gods of the Near East, where you would engage in sacrifice to them and make deals, basically, God is ontologically changing those who are sacrificed to him and making them sacred, and that's sort of the primary theme of Japhtha, in my opinion, or my understanding of the commentaries from the church.
Okay, that's fair enough. Did you have a thought on that, Joshua? Did you want to add to that, or?
No, I think I'll pass on that one.
That one's a really tough one, because I can say it's actually not clear. I'm looking at the actual passage here, and it's not really clear exactly what happens to the woman. So I know that it says right here, "You may go," he said, and he let her go for 2 months. She and her friends went into the hills and wept because she would never marry. After the 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. Now, some would say that must mean that he killed her, and others would say that there was a different interpretation. And so. And she was a virgin, it says right after that. So this is a very tough one, but I think it does speak to going back to what Jesus even said to the devil: you shouldn't basically test God.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a tough one. So
thank you for saying that.
I was listening to Pine Creek Doug and this morning, talking to Inspiring Philosophy, like I mentioned, and another thing that he said is, what happens if he got in a car accident? And he asked this question to every Christian: what happens if he got into a car accident and he showed up at the pearly gates, and one of you showed up at the pearly gates with him, and he's wondering if Jesus said, okay, basically, Pine Creek, you didn't believe, so you're not going to come into heaven, but I will permit you to remain alive, but without being in heaven. I will permit you to remain alive if either Joshua or Andrew is willing to sacrifice their time in heaven for you.
I want to still answer what Andrew just said, or what Andrew said, and just say I want to trust who it was, who the message was. I don't think Jesus would say that, but go ahead, Andrew.
Sure. So so you're basically left with two options, right? If you have complete confidence that this is Christ talking to you, then the correct response, I think, is to say, well, Christ, what do you say that I should do? And then do that. So that's one option. The other is, and I've never been to heaven, so I don't know the context of how confident I would be. Is you have to look at the consistency of the message with your spiritual walk, right? And Ignatius, Saint Ignatius, who founded the Jesuits, has a big book on how to do this. But basically, it comes down to: is it in accord with what's right? Will it only lead to good things? Does it require a sacrifice on your part? Would it be something you feel guilty about? So on and so forth, right? And me personally, it's speaking right here in this moment, it's something that would make me feel guilty, right? That in some sense I'm sacrificing a good, but I'm not certain that sacrifice is for a better good. And so, that's sort of the elaborate answer I give.
Okay, well, let me ask you this question, because we're getting some tough questions from the audience right now. So I've got, actually, I want to say a shout out to everybody who's in the audience. I see a lot of people. Shannon Q, is always awesome to see you. And Brian Stevens, we've had a nice chat before. And JB and Stickman and Colonel's Crazy Adventure. And I know that there have been some other people that's the names I see right in front of me. But Brian Stevens is asking a very tough question. He says, now what happens, and I don't know if either of you have kids, I don't recall if you told me that or not, but what happens if one of your children decides that he's going to be an atheist, and he decides that he's going to walk away and not go to heaven? He doesn't really care about heaven. He thinks that heaven's going to be miserable anyway because he doesn't want to be around for an eternity. And so he's decided that he's going to walk away and ignore God. And would you feel good if you were in heaven knowing that your child is not there because he decided he didn't want to be there?
Well, again, I would raise my kids with character. If at the end of the day that they verbally said God doesn't exist, that wouldn't be as important as if they treat others well, as if they feed the poor and help those who need it. And I always remember this. And sometimes I tell my students this, that there's something in John's gospel when Jesus is about to ascend to heaven. He says to Peter, I believe it's Peter, Jesus says, "Feed my sheep," and he says that again to Peter, "Feed my sheep." Peter says, "Oh, of course," and he says, "Will you feed my sheep?" And that's twice. And then a third time, or no, excuse me, I got that a little confused. Do you love me? Do you love me? And in the Greek, it changes a bit, and Jesus is asking something much more profound there. We have to treat others well. We have to live a life of virtue. When I teach American and U.S. history, I know the literature. I study it all the time. The beginning of the U.S. was founded on a belief in virtue. It wasn't founded on a belief in separation of church and state. That's dubious. There's nothing like that. That's in a letter from.
Let me see if I can rephrase what you're saying. So you're saying, so long as people are good, they're going to go to heaven, even if they deny God.
I don't know. I think we're not just held accountable for what we say verbally. I think our panoply of actions and how we live in the world and help others has something to do with it. But of course, it says that in the New Testament that if you confess with your mouth, you will be saved. It says that in Romans 10. So I think it's a more profound question, and I think it makes all of us tremble with fear what are we doing with our lives? This isn't a game. We have to be mature and responsible human beings. This is how I talk as a teacher. We can't, of course, I don't bring up all the theology. Of course, you can't get away from history without bringing up theology. But I think it's a much more profound question than that. I would bring my kid up with characteristics. I would, as Jesus as the role model.
Okay, but what if you did do that, and because they're still at these the atheists who are in the chat here are still asking, they want a deeper answer, basically saying, how would you feel if you're in heaven and you know your child is burning in hell? I think that's sort of the gist of what I'm seeing here from Brian. And another question is, why would God even allow other religions to exist in the world? That's the second question we'll have to address.
So I'll answer the child burning in hell thing. So the scenario is that I've made it through the door and I am in heaven, right? Or I have the fullness of the presence of God, and I am oriented towards God. and my child has totally apostatized from God and rejected God and is in hell. And how would I feel about that? So there are a couple things that we have to answer, right? That one is, if I have reached this most blessed state, I have full unity with God. So that means that I have all the knowledge that God has. So I know exactly the details of the orientation of my child's spirit and the details of what's occurring to them, right? And the other thing is, we know exactly what God is. God is just. And so insofar as the damned child is experiencing hell, they are getting exactly their just desserts. And so how does a parent feel when they see their child get exactly what they deserve? I mean, that's fundamentally the question, right? And if they're a good parent, they should want their child to get what they deserve, right?
Well, do you believe in a literal lake of fire?
Well, I mean,
because that means your child is going to be burning. That's what the atheists would say.
Yeah, well, true, but
You know, I don't.
That's the thing, though, is I would also know that that's what they deserve, right? And that's sort of the thing, and you have to look at this sort of analogically. That let's say that you have a child who bullies other children, right? Who's vicious, who totally bullies weak kids and whatever. I'm pretty sure that as a parent, and I don't have kids, that I would think it would be hilarious if my bullying child got like bitten by a child he was bullying and like cried about it. I think that would be funny because it's like this comeuppance and just desserts, and you know that's a minor thing, but this just shows that not every pain that our children experience is something a parent would frown at, per se.
Do you think that denying God as a finite crime is something that deserves infinite punishment? I'm kind of rephrasing what someone asked here.
Well, it depends, right? If you're, well, it depends on the firmness of your stance, right? And this is sort of like is it a verbal denial, or is it an denial in your spirit, right? Or do you act as though there is a God, but you don't articulate what that means and show that God exists in your actions? So there are lots of variation here. And you know, I trust in God to make that judgment, and I don't think it would be fair to damn someone for an intellectual mistake. But I think it's entirely reasonable to damn someone for orienting their infinite spirit away from God, right? And that's the thing, is that the things we do and the choices we make are significant, and the heaven or hell are consequences of that. Go for it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead and finish.
Yeah, and that's all I'd say, is that it depends on whether you mean you're orienting your spirit or your being away from God purposely, or if you're just sort of floundering, let's say.
So do you think it's possible that now in Romans 1, it makes it pretty clear that it says that everyone knows God, and I've got some atheists here who are in the chat, like Shannon Q, who said that she's never received any sort of revelation from God that God exists. Does that make her someone who's not telling the truth, or is that just something that, or is it possible that Romans 1 is wrong?
Well, do you want to hit this one first, Joshua?
I'll let you hit it, but I wanted to bring up something. First, considering my kid, when we were going back, let me back up. Considering if I was in heaven and the kid was in hell, before that even got there, I would start teaching my kids how to read and study philosophy and look at it with an open mind, not be confused by a David Hume or a Spinoza or some of these silly verification or falsification arguments from the logical positives. By the way, logical positivism is now dead. The death of God movement of the 60s is now dead because, as I brought up during the debate we had today, there's been a revolution in philosophy. And many of the brightest philosophers today are Christians, outspoken Christians. So I would probably introduce my kid or kids to Thomas Reid and that Scottish common sense philosophy, that same philosophy that was so influential in America. Jonathan Witherspoon influenced, I believe it was 12 governors, 56 congressmen, 20 justices or judges, and one U.S. president under James Madison. That's the type of thing, the type of influence that the Scottish Common Sense School had. I would also introduce him to William James, of course, and Immanuel Kant, and people are thinkers, not these unmitigated skeptics. So I'm confident that my child wouldn't be a atheist.
So if you introduce, so what you're saying is if they read enough, they won't be an atheist. But what about the counter argument that what about a guy like Nietzsche? Nietzsche obviously was well read, very knowledgeable. He's actually probably one of the most intelligent atheists I think I've ever even heard of. Extremely intelligent, and his writings are very insightful. And even what he said about God and the future of a communistic type of world, he was very prescient in his writings and his knowledge. So how does, there is an intelligent person, and there are intelligent atheists, Bertrand Russell, there's a bunch of them. How do you explain that?
I don't know where my quote is. It's in the thing, what Nietzsche wrote, it's called The Madman. And he comes to a group and he says, have you seen God? And they're looking at him like, are you crazy? The point is that Nietzsche himself knew that without God, eventually it's going to lead to the destruction of reality. Now Nietzsche is trusting in Hegel, okay, in Hegel and Hegelian philosophy, and that views all as one, that views reality as one. So I'm just confident that my child wouldn't be like that. And I think, call me crazy, but I think that's my answer. Okay.
Well, let me ask you this. Say your child is, say someone's child is burning in hell, and this is another question that I've heard from a lot of atheists. Why would God even allow that person to exist in the first place if he knows that that's where the child is going to end up?
Well, he created people, a large amount of people, knowing that some of them would freely reject him, but that a large number would freely come to him in humility and fear and trembling, as Kierkegaard would say, as one of his books say. So maybe it's true to get as many people, you're going to have a certain percentage of the population that is rebellious or wants to create God in their own idiosyncratic way. And follow the God of their own dictates of money or sex or power. So I think if God was to create a world where all people freely came to him, how do we know that world doesn't have one member or maybe a handful of members? Maybe it's the case that to get as many people to come to him freely, throughout history, you're going to have inevitably some that freely will to not follow him in a humble way.
So I have a slightly different take, which is there is no logical reason. It is entirely logical consistent that all can be saved. that it's possible that hell is empty. The issue I have with people saying, well, why would God create people if he knew that they were in hell or going to hell, is that basically God thought it worth the risk, right? And we don't actually know, we don't know what the state of things is until the end. And part of being made in the image of God is that once we are as we go through sanctification and come closer to God, we actually synergistically and cooperatively engage in the creative act with God. And to do this, we need to have fully independent wills. And so it's not a question of the question of heaven and hell, in some sense, is whether you're going to participate in creation and the creative act, which includes adding your own unique light and creativity to it, or if you're going to opt out towards non-existence as much as you can. And that's sort of the bifurcation, right? And we don't know that until the game is ended.
Okay, well, that brings me to another sort of issue that I hear a lot from atheists. Okay.
Can I ask y'all a really sophisticated atheist question?
Sure.
Okay. An atheist walks into a sandwich shop, and he's not allowed to get his favorite ham and cheese sandwich, and then proclaims that his suffering shows that God does not exist because God did not give him the sandwich. How would you reply to that sophisticated argument?
So based on the fact so you're saying that based on the fact that there is a temporary suffering, that God doesn't exist? I see you laughing while you're asking. Is that what you're saying? So that because there's a temporary suffering, yes. I don't think that an atheist would actually say that. I think that, but I do think that sometimes there is a problem with pain, and I do think that there are many atheists who would probably say that something, maybe something very bad happened in their life, and they felt like they called out to God and felt that God didn't answer them, and therefore there must not be a God. And so I think that might be more of what we would see. They called out to God and tried to get an answer, and it seemed like God wasn't responding. How I would answer that is I would look into you look into the fact that God is sovereign and just have to trust in him, that whatever occurs in your life or has occurred in your life it serves some sort of a purpose that is going to make life better for you or for others eventually.
Okay, Andrew?
Sorry, could you restate the question real quickly?
Yeah. An atheist walks into a sandwich shop and he's not allowed to get his ham sandwich. And he feels that all this suffering confronts him and shows that God doesn't exist. Now, what do you think about that type of argument? I bring it up because I think it's at the level of many type of arguments. Not all, but a good sufficient.
Yeah, well, I mean, this has been sort of the question of suffering in the world for a long time, and the answer from most philosophers from Socrates onwards is you suffer because you are what's broken, not the situation. And I mean the Buddhists agree with this too. The reason you suffer isn't because you're not getting a ham sandwich; it's because you overmuch
desire a ham sandwich. Interesting. Okay, well, let me go to another question. Let me just bring. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Let me just bring something up. B.F. Skinner and his associate Watson, they believe that these immediate consequences are what was of supreme importance. That behaviorism. That they could make a person do whatever. So they reduced morality or induced everything to this behavioral type principle. And I think we are better than that. And I think that has really, I think that's one thing that's a problem with our education system. And you know, our students not thinking outside of the concrete, the operational concrete, which, you know, Jean Piaget would say. I think people that don't think outside, that don't think outside of immediate consequences and don't think abstractly, but only think at one level concretely, I think it has a lot to do with a schizophrenic pathology, you know, in not seeing the signs of natural theology in the world. And I think I don't think a lot of the arguments from the atheist side are really sophisticated.
Well, let me go into that, because that actually reminds me of another argument that I've seen from atheists with respect to free will and omnipotence. Do you think that those two are contradictory? Is it possible for people to have free will with an omnipotent God? And I have an answer for this, but I wanted to hear yours.
Well, my argument would be the same as William Lane Craig's, but before him, he got it from someone named, well, Molina, his middle knowledge, a middle knowledge perspective, not a divine, not foreknowledge, but middle knowledge. God knows what we would do if placed under certain circumstances or of the like. So God knows what we will do freely under every possible circumstance, but we can still do it freely because it deals with hypotheticals. And you see in many of these hypotheticals, these if-then statements in the Bible, but in both the Old and New Testament. So I think there's no problem with God having a knowledge because of who he is, omnipotent, and we having free will if you adopt a middle knowledge perspective.
So then why, and I'm looking at Brian Stevens' question, he says, God should give us the circumstances that lead us to heaven since he can. Do you think that God has put us all in circumstances that are possible to lead us to heaven? Is there do you believe that that's occurred? So if God did put us in those circumstances, why have some people chosen to walk away from God?
Well,
I think it's. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Andrew. I've been talking.
Sure, because I mean, that's the thing, right? The circumstances that maximize our chances to heaven don't imply that we don't have choice anymore, right? Just because, to use an example, just because I court a woman as effectively as I can, that I write her poetry, I get the approval for her family, and so on and so forth. I make a big effort and do everything possible to make it as likely as possible that she'll accept my proposal of marriage. That doesn't mean that she has to do it, right? Even if she's the type of woman who has wanted to get married since she was 6 years old, and I match every criteria that she has, just because all of these things are met doesn't mean that free will is overruled.
Okay, so neither of you are determinists. Neither of you are falling in the Seitan Bruggencate camp of determinism and Calvinism, then.
Correct. I mean, I believe that our free will is part of the causal chain, right? And there are causes of the way we will, and our will then causes causes. In that sense, I'm a determinist, but not in the sense that I don't believe that human will is not important to our salvation.
I don't know if you've heard of something called, well, I'm sure you have. You are both brilliant. Agent causation. That's how we know about causes. Thomas Reid in the Scottish Common Sense School goes through it and say we would never know two events like billiard balls hitting one another. We would never form the proposition, the conjunction that A causes B unless we knew it from our own powers, from an analogy from from agent causation. So we use analogy of the causal structure of the world from who we are. It's from analogy. David Hume, when he looked at causation, he said they are merely two things constantly conjoined. It's like they appear repeatedly together. Now, common sense says, well, that doesn't fly. I know I read it in the debate earlier today, and I want just one more time. It's very short. This is Thomas Reed when he sends his manuscript to David Hume. We see then that Mr. Hume's philosophy is very much like a hobby horse, which a man when he is ill can keep at home with him and ride to his contentment. But just in case he should bring it to the marketplace, his friends would quickly impel a jury and confiscate his estates and have the solicitude never to leave him alone. The ultimate bearing on what shows a philosophy to be correct is common sense and our intuitions of those. I think I got off topic a little bit. I just wanted to bring it up.
Okay, that's fair. Now that reminds me of another question, and I'm looking at the, and I want to say hi to everybody in the chat. I'm so glad to see all of you. Kyle, it's always good to see you too, and Renevelation and HistoryNet and everybody here, GPH, and Cameron. But I wanted to ask another question that I hear a lot, and that is, what if Christianity is true, why are there some Christians who are discriminatory or who act in very bad ways? If it's true, why are there some really bad Christians out there?
Because propositional knowledge does not always instantiate in action. I mean, that's sort of the fundamental problem of being human and fallen, right? We know what we ought to do, but we do not do it. And I mean, Christianity literally teaches that this is the case. So,
and I believe it says that in Romans. Is it Romans 7 or 6 or 5?
Yeah, probably Romans.
Yeah, Romans, one of those chapters. Yeah, and Paul makes that distinction that there's something always pulling at us, and it's character that. The more times we tell the truth, the more times we're nicer to each other. We build character. We build what Aristotle called eudaimonia, that virtue for its own sake. What William James said that selective process that we all have, that selective process. The world of facts outnumber by a multitude the world of values, and it's common sense that will get us through and show us what to do. Again, I got off course.
No, it's good. So that's and then I want to ask another thing, and actually someone in the audience just asked if the universe were proven to be eternal, would that rule out the possibility of God? And well, I could answer that myself, actually, is that would actually rule out the possibility of the Christian God, because it says very specifically in the beginning, in the first lines in Genesis. So I just wanted to say that particular question. I am asking the audience, if you have any questions, go ahead and post them in the chat so I can ask Andrew and Joshua any new questions that you have. So I want to say hi to Craig also. I see him in the chat. Always good to see Craig.
I don't know if that would did you say disprove God?
Well, they're asking if the universe were proven to be eternal, instead of having, like, we have a theory that's been endorsed by many scientists of the Big Bang that says that basically dates the universe about 13.8 billion years. So if that were not the going theory, if we had some way to prove that did not occur, and that the universe is eternal, would that rule out the possibility of a God?
It depends. No. Well, yeah.
Go ahead, Andrew.
So it would depend on the strength of the eternal model, right? If it's just like a physical model of physics, it doesn't necessarily even rule out the Genesis account, right? Because a physical model is just saying this is how we predict things to occur. And actually, back 1,000 years ago, roughly, when Thomas Aquinas was doing his proofs in the Summa Theologica, he actually believed that from like natural revelation or reason alone, that it was more reasonable to think that the universe was eternal than created, and that we could only know that it was created through the divine revelation of the Bible. And basically, that's the point of contention, right? Is that would it be a defeater for Genesis in the sense of being created or not?
I think that's fair. Did you want to say anything, Josh?
Well, I don't think it would. I think there's other arguments that would still apply. I mean, you know, for the existence of God, we would still have to come to grips with, you know, the absurdity of life without God. In the long tradition of atheists who are, you know, of the French existentialists who said that they could not live consistently and happily if God does not exist. There's so many other, the argument for objective moral values, the arguments for aesthetics. You know, C.S. Lewis gave an argument for joy, and I find it very persuasive. I'm not going to give it today, but I think there's a plethora of arguments out there that, you know, I think the arguments for natural theology are like a piece of or like a like chainmail, like a medieval knight would wear. You can take one of the links out, but there's still the whole suit, okay? And there's still a barrier between what's reasonable, Christian theism, and what's unreasonable, which is, you know, this secularism, at least in the radical atheist perspective.
Okay, I'm gonna add. I have another question that came in from the audience, but I'm going to change it just a little bit because I want to latch it in with the Old Testament, because it's something I see all the time. But people would say, why did God order? You know, in the Old Testament, there are examples where God ordered people to go into war. Why did God order, for example, people to go into the land of Canaan and have the Canaanites die? So why did he order that? Why would an omnibenevolent God, omnipotent God, and an all omniscient God, why would he demand that people go to war in the Old Testament?
Well,
go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, so I mean, the Christian perspective on what a just war is, it has to meet four constraints, basically, right? It has to be a last resort, that nothing else can be effective. It has to be proportional to the evil that is being made, right? So you can't go nuclear on a tribe that only has bone knives or whatever. It has to have good probability of bringing greater good into it than into being than the evil of war itself. And I think roughly a fourth is that it uses roughly something like a quarter is given as quickly as possible if the enemy retreats or what have you. And so this is what governs, or should govern, what Christians use when they're deciding whether or not to go to war. God, of course, has infinite knowledge of what will occur if and not only if the Israelites obey these commands, but he also has a good idea of how they will obey them or not obey them, right? So that's sort of the thing, is that and this is a defense. It's not a full explanation. It's a defense that if this war would meet these four criterion, under the Christian understanding, it would be a just war. And God has enough knowledge to know whether or not it met these criteria. So engaging in warfare specifically is permissible under these circumstances, and God would know if these circumstances applied. And if we trust in God, we can just trust that God fulfilled this for it, right? And if we look at the Canaanite conquest and the things that occurred, that was necessary for the kingdom of Israel to come about, and the kingdom of Israel was necessary for Christ to come about in the way that he did.
Okay. What about, why would God allow babies to drown during Noah's time?
Well, why does he allow babies to die in general? I mean, the frustration I have with this argument from atheists is, if you're going to complain about death, why aren't you complaining about death in general? Why are you complaining that that babies die of drowning in Noah's time versus, malaria 1,000 years before or 1,000 years after? What difference does it make the mechanism if death is still permitted? God is the one ultimately responsible for the universe in either case, and so it just ends up being the problem of evil again.
Okay, Josh, did you want to answer either of those?
Historically, they also practice bestiality and cannibalism. So, I don't think that's a real moral improvement. I think God brings judgment on certain people groups for certain actions, just as I believe that he brings judgment on us, to teach us, not just to hold us accountable, but to teach us, and so we'll be better people. But in that case, there was 400 years, and he gave them the chance to repent and become better. They did not, and they kept doing that stuff. So I think, can we do that today? No. That was God who did that. That's a singular event. And, what we are to do is love people and try to teach them with character. Again, that's getting a little off topic, but Andrew, you said such a great point. I didn't have much to add, so great. Good,
thank you. Well, if I think we should get towards the conclusion here. I wanted to see if there's any other questions coming in. Oh, wait a second. God, with his middle knowledge, looked at every possible way to handle people not worshiping him, and his middle knowledge showed him the best way is to kill babies. That's what Brian Stevens just said. I just read his comment there. I don't know if you wanted to comment. I wanted to say something. Let me just comment on one thing. As far as the idea of omnipotence and free will and middle knowledge and that sort of thing, is I believe that God has put us all in a position to go to heaven, and the active resistance towards that is actually just us in our nature going against what has been, what is part of our nature. I think naturally within us, we're all given this innate drive to seek God, and I think that some people do resist that. And I also will say that Pew poll, and I know Shannon doesn't like that I'm going to say this, and I'm not sure if it's the perfect poll, but it does say that atheism is one of the lowest as far as retention rates. The indicator from Pew is 30%. It has a 30% retention rate, which gives me great hope that many of the people who are in our chat will one day see the light, and we can all walk into heaven. So would you like to, Andrew or Josh, are there any questions that you guys think that we've missed or that we should cover?
Nothing comes to mind on my end.
Josh, your speaker's not on.
Okay, thank you. I just will say this. I am so hungry. So after the debate, I didn't really have breakfast, and after this, I'm just so hungry. I'm ready to go eat. Now, let me just let me I think on Twitter, I think we all need to calm down a little. And I hope we can all understand that. We're all in this world together, and I don't mean any ill will toward anyone.
Yeah, I think it's always good to try to have a sense of humor. I have to piggyback on that.
Oh man, I don't have a sense of humor. I'm gonna have to work on that.
So when
you do have a sense of humor with your troll comment yesterday. I thought that was.
Well, when I say the Salvation Army is teaching atheists how to read, I'm joking, guys. Again, we're all in this together in some respect. So, let's.
Well, I agree, and I think we should all strive to be as kind as we possibly can, and we're actually called on that to do that, and to try to be like Christ as much as possible, and try to think, what would Jesus do in this incident, and look that way. That always can help us. Well, I wanted to let everybody know I'm going to be back on here in a half hour to talk to Jonathan Sheffield, who is going to be interviewing Richard Carrier in December, and he is going to give us his game plan and his strategy. So at 2:00, I'll be back here in a half hour to chat with Jonathan. So those of you listening, I hope you'll tune in and hear what he has to say about his strategy to go up against Jesus mythicist, Richard Carrier. So, all right, I guess we'll go ahead and final words as far as, would you guys like to share where we can find you again with anyone who might have just joined us?
Sure, I'm a Stratelates on Twitter and occasionally blog at redpillreligion.com.
Yes, I am a Master Apologist on Twitter because I am. Okay, and you can find me on my blog at christian-apologist.com. I try to write as much as I can, and also you can find me on Twitter at LEAD1225. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming in here. Thank you for, I love seeing, I'm really excited about the people who joined us today. I know everyone who's in the chat, and it's actually, we had a really good turnout. So this is just wonderful. I want to thank you guys all for showing up. And I will see you again on Twitter. And goodbye, everybody. God bless you all.